Good evening, time traveler. Get comfortable, take a deep breath, and prepare for a journey into one of medieval life's most arduous experiences. Tonight, we're going to experience what it was really like to travel long distances by wagon in medieval Europe, roughly from the 11th through the 15th centuries. But forget the images of romantic journeys through picturesque countryside, comfortable covered wagons rolling along smooth roads, and exciting adventures on the open road. That's not our story tonight. Our journey takes us into the crude wagons with no suspension bouncing over rutted dirt tracks, through the forests where bandits waited to rob travelers, across the roads that were often just muddy tracks impassable in rain, and into the understanding that a journey of 100 miles might take 2 weeks of bone-jarring misery, constant fear, and expenses that could bankrupt a merchant. This isn't the sanitized version where travel was an adventure. This is the reality. The wheels that broke constantly requiring repairs, the oxen that moved at walking pace for 10-15 miles per day, the tolls charged at every bridge and town gate, and the knowledge that many travelers never reached their destinations because they were robbed, killed, or simply died from exposure or disease on the road. Before we begin, leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. And if there's another historical topic you'd like me to explore, let me know. Your suggestions shape these journeys. Now, let's load a medieval wagon and discover what long-distance travel meant when the journey itself was often more dangerous than staying home. If you were traveling long distances by wagon in medieval Europe, you were probably a merchant transporting goods, a pilgrim heading to a holy site, a noble's household moving between estates, or someone forced to relocate for economic or political reasons. Ordinary peasants rarely traveled beyond their immediate area. They were tied to their land and lacked resources for travel. The decision to undertake a long wagon journey wasn't made lightly because travel was expensive, dangerous, and exhausting. You needed compelling reason, profit, piety, or necessity to justify the risks and costs. The wagons themselves were crude vehicles by modern standards, constructed entirely of wood with iron reinforcements at stress points. The typical medieval wagon consisted of a wooden frame mounted on 4 wheels, with sides made of wooden planks or wicker, sometimes covered with canvas or leather to protect cargo from weather. There was no suspension system beyond the slight flexibility of the wooden frame and wheels. Every bump, rut, and stone in the road transmitted directly to the wagon bed and everything in it. The wheels were solid wood or wooden wheels with iron rims, heavy and prone to breaking. The axles were wooden beams that required constant greasing with animal fat to prevent friction from setting them on fire. The size of wagons varied by purpose and region, but a typical freight wagon might be 12 to 15 feet long and 6-7 feet wide, capable of carrying perhaps 1-2 tons of cargo, depending on road conditions and the strength of draft animals. Larger wagons existed, but were impractical for most roads. The weight capacity was limited not by the wagon's strength, but by what the animals could pull over poor roads. On flat, dry roads, oxen could pull substantial loads. On muddy or steep roads, even light loads became impossible, and wagons had to be partially unloaded to The draft animals that pulled wagons were primarily oxen, though horses were sometimes used for lighter, fast. Oxen were preferred for heavy freight because they were stronger, cheaper to maintain, more docile, and could survive on rougher forage than horses. A pair of oxen could pull a loaded wagon at walking pace, about 2 to 3 miles per hour, on good roads. For heavy loads or difficult terrain, you needed teams of 4, 6, or even 8 oxen. The oxen had to be fed, watered, and rested regularly, limiting daily travel distance to 10 to 15 miles under good conditions, less in bad weather or difficult terrain. The roads that medieval wagons traveled were vastly inferior to modern roads or even Roman roads. The Roman road network had degraded significantly since antiquity, with many roads falling into disrepair. Medieval roads were mostly unpaved dirt tracks that followed ancient routes or natural terrain features. In dry weather, the roads were dusty and rutted from previous traffic. In wet weather, they became muddy quagmires where wagons sank to their axles and became stuck. The depth of mud could make roads completely impassable, forcing travelers to wait days or weeks for conditions to improve or to find alternate routes. The road maintenance was minimal and sporadic. In theory, landowners were responsible for maintaining roads through their territories, and towns were supposed to maintain roads near settlements. In practice, enforcement was inconsistent, and maintenance was often neglected. Some major routes received regular attention, filling ruts, clearing drainage ditches, removing obstacles. But most roads were left to deteriorate until they became unusable. Then travelers simply created new tracks around the worst sections, creating braided networks of parallel paths. The proliferation of alternate tracks made navigation difficult and allowed bandits multiple ambush points. The speed of wagon travel was determined by the slowest pace sustainable by oxen, which was walking speed. On good roads in favorable weather, you might cover 12 to 15 miles per day. On poor roads in mountains or in bad weather, you might manage only 5 to 8 miles. This meant that a journey of 100 miles, the distance from Paris to Orleans or London to York, would take 7 to 10 days minimum, often longer. A journey of 300-400 miles might take a month or more. The slow pace was frustrating but unavoidable given the limitations of animal power and road conditions. The daily routine of wagon travel began at dawn. You fed and harnessed the oxen, loaded or checked cargo, and started moving as early as possible to maximize daylight hours. You traveled until mid-afternoon or whenever you reached a suitable stopping place, usually a town, village, or known camping spot. The oxen needed rest, water, and fodder. You needed food. The evening hours were spent tending animals, repairing any damage to wagon or equipment, eating a simple meal, and sleeping. The routine was monotonous and exhausting, repeated day after day until you reached your destination. The cargo that wagons carried varied by season and route, but included wool, cloth, wine, grain, salt, iron, tools, luxury goods for the wealthy, and household goods for those relocating. The cargo had to be carefully loaded to balance weight and prevent shifting that could overturn the wagon. Valuable or fragile goods were packed in the center, protected by cheaper items. Everything was covered and tied down to protect from weather and theft. Loading and unloading was heavy manual labor requiring multiple people. Merchants traveling with valuable cargo hired armed guards, adding to the expense but providing some security against bandits. The weather that travelers faced was a major factor determining journey difficulty and success. Rain turned roads to mud and made travel miserable or impossible. You got soaked because the wagon covers were rarely waterproof. Your cargo might be damaged despite covering. The cold in winter made travel brutal. You had no heating except body warmth and whatever clothing you wore. The heat in summer meant thirst, dust. Snow and ice made roads impassable and threatened you with freezing. Many travelers planned journeys to avoid worst weather, traveling in spring and autumn when conditions were most favorable. But urgent business sometimes required winter or summer travel regardless of conditions. The river crossings that blocked routes were major obstacles requiring ferries, fords, or bridges. Bridges were rare and valuable infrastructure, often privately owned with tolls charged for crossing. The bridges were wooden structures that required constant maintenance and sometimes collapsed under heavy wagons. Ferries operated at major river crossings, consisting of flat-bottomed boats large enough for wagons and animals. The ferry crossing was time-consuming, expensive, and potentially dangerous if the river was in flood. Fords, shallow crossing points, could be used when water levels were low, but you risked getting stuck in river bottom or having cargo damaged by water. Each river crossing added hours to travel time and costs to the journey. The tolls that travelers paid were significant expense that added substantially to journey costs. Bridges, town gates, mountain passes, and even some road sections had tolls charged by whoever controlled them, lords, towns, monasteries, or toll collectors who'd purchased the right. The tolls were supposedly for road maintenance, but were often just revenue sources. A long journey might require paying dozens of tolls, each taking a percentage of your cargo value or charging by wagon size and animal count. The accumulated tolls could consume much of your profit margin if you were merchant. The toll collectors were often corrupt, charging more than authorized rates or inventing reasons for extra charges. The bandits that plagued medieval roads were a constant threat, especially in forested areas and remote regions. Bandit groups ranged from a few desperate men to organized gangs of dozens. They targeted merchants with valuable cargo, wealthy travelers, and pilgrims. The attack might be ambush from cover, roadblock requiring payment, or nighttime raid on camping travelers. Bandits took cargo, money, animals, and sometimes killed victims to prevent identification. Traveling in groups or hiring armed escorts provided some protection, but wasn't foolproof. The bandit problem was worse in some regions and periods than others, depending on local law enforcement and economic conditions. Many merchants accepted robbery as inevitable business cost. The forests that covered much of medieval Europe created dangerous travel conditions. The roads through forests were narrow, dark, and perfect for ambushes. The dense trees prevented escape or maneuvering. Fallen trees or deliberate obstacles could block paths, forcing travelers to stop where bandits waited. Wolves and bears posed additional dangers, especially to animals. Travelers feared forests as places of danger and evil, where outlaws and supernatural threats lurked. The clearing of forests for agriculture gradually reduced these dangers, but large forested areas remained throughout the medieval period. Many travelers hired local guides familiar with forest routes and dangers. The accommodation available to travelers ranged from nothing to inadequate. In towns and some villages, inns provided lodging, food, and stabling for animals. The quality varied enormously. Some inns were decent establishments, others were filthy hovels. The cost was significant. A night's lodging might equal a day's wages for a laborer. The inns were often overcrowded, with multiple travelers sharing rooms or sleeping in common areas. Between towns, you might find monasteries or religious houses that offered hospitality to travelers as Christian charity. The quality was usually better than inns. Clean beds, adequate food, and safety. Though the monks expected donations and travelers were required to attend religious services, the camping that travelers did when no accommodation was available meant sleeping in or under the wagon in crude tents or simply on the ground with blankets. You camped at known stopping points where other travelers gathered for safety in numbers. The campsites had water sources and sometimes basic facilities, cleared areas, fire rings, perhaps rough shelters. Camping exposed you to weather, cold, and bandit attacks during the night. Someone had to stay awake to guard animals and cargo. The nights were long, uncomfortable, and frightening, especially in unfamiliar territory or bad weather. Many travelers pushed to reach towns rather than camp in wilderness. The food that travelers ate was simple, monotonous, and often inadequate. You carried dried or preserved foods, bread, cheese, salted meat or fish, dried fruits, nuts. Fresh food spoiled quickly and couldn't be preserved for long journeys. Water was carried in skins or barrels, but was often contaminated or foul-tasting. Beer or wine traveled better than water and was safer to drink. At towns, you could buy fresh bread, cooked meals, and replenish supplies. The diet lacked variety and fresh vegetables, leading to nutritional deficiencies on long journeys. Merchants and wealthy travelers ate better than common folk, but even they suffered from limited food options on the road. The illnesses and injuries that occurred during travel were serious problems with limited treatment options. The bouncing wagon caused back pain, bruises, and sometimes injuries from cargo shifting. Exposure to weather caused colds, fevers, and pneumonia. Contaminated water or food caused dysentery. Injuries from accidents, falling from wagons, being kicked by animals, wagon tip-overs, could be disabling or fatal. If you became seriously ill or injured during the journey, your options were limited. Small towns might have a barber surgeon who could set bones or treat wounds crudely. Monasteries might provide basic care. But serious illnesses often meant abandoning the journey or dying on the road. The breakdowns that wagons suffered were frequent and required immediate repair, or the journey couldn't continue. Wheels broke from hitting stones or ruts. Requiring replacement or repair, a skilled carpenter could fashion a new wheel, but it took time and materials. Axles cracked under stress, requiring reinforcement or replacement. The wagon bed or frame could break from overloading or rough roads. Iron fittings worked loose and had to be secured. The canvas covers tore and needed patching. Every town of any size had wheelwrights and blacksmiths who repaired wagons, but their services cost money and time. Carrying spare parts and repair materials was wise, but added weight and expense. The animal care that was essential for a successful journey required constant attention. Oxen needed water several times daily, fodder, hay or grass, morning and evening, and rest periods. They had to be checked for injuries, lameness, or illness. The harnesses and yokes had to fit properly to prevent sores and chafing. The animal's hooves needed attention to prevent lameness. If an ox became lame or sick, you had to either rest until it recovered or replace it, buying or renting another animal at whatever price local sellers demanded. The loss of draft animals could strand you unless you could find replacements. Caring for animals took more time and effort than caring for yourself. The navigation that travelers used was based on landmarks, local knowledge, and asking directions. There were no accurate maps available to ordinary travelers. You knew major routes from experience or description. Follow this river to that town, cross the bridge, take the left fork at the Old Oak. Signposts were rare. Getting lost was easy, especially in unfamiliar territory or when alternate tracks confused the route. Hiring local guides for difficult sections was common practice. Merchants who traveled regular routes learned them thoroughly and shared knowledge with other traders. Pilgrims followed well-known pilgrimage routes with churches and hospices marking the way. The seasons that determined travel feasibility varied by region, but generally made spring and autumn best for travel. Winter brought freezing temperatures, snow, ice, and shorter daylight hours. Many roads became impassable, and travel was dangerous. Summer brought heat, dust, and dry conditions that were better for roads but hard on travelers and animals. Spring thaw turned roads to mud, but conditions improved as ground dried. Autumn, before the rains, had good conditions, but shortening days. Merchants timed their journeys to trade fairs and market cycles, often traveling in spring to reach summer fairs or in autumn after harvest, when agricultural goods were available. The fear that travelers experienced, was constant companion. Fear of bandits, of getting lost, of breakdown in remote area, of illness or injury far from help, of weather turning deadly, of never reaching destination. The medieval world was full of genuine dangers and imagined supernatural threats. Travelers told stories of ghosts, demons, and monsters encountered on roads. Whether these were misidentified natural phenomena, fabrications, or genuine beliefs is unclear. But the fear they caused was real. Traveling through unknown territory in medieval Europe meant facing dangers that could kill you and having limited resources to protect yourself. The social interactions that occurred during travel included meeting other travelers, dealing with toll collectors and local authorities, negotiating with innkeepers and ferrymen, and hiring guides or guards. These interactions could be friendly, hostile, or simply transactional. Travelers shared information about road conditions, dangers, and opportunities. They sometimes banded together for safety, but there was also suspicion. Any stranger could be a bandit scout or confidence trickster. The social dynamics of medieval travel involved balancing trust and caution, cooperation, and self-protection. The religious aspects of travel included prayers for safe journey, vows to saints for protection, and stopping at churches or shrines along the route. Many travelers were pilgrims whose entire journey was religious exercise, but even merchants and other secular travelers observed religious practices. Sunday travel was technically forbidden by church law and was avoided when possible. Religious holidays were observed. Travelers sought blessings from priests before departing and gave thanks upon safe arrival. The religious framework provided psychological comfort in dangerous situations and social structure for interactions with monasteries and churches that provided hospitality. The specific example of a merchant journey from Bruges to Frankfurt, a major trade route connecting Flanders textile centers to German trade fairs, illustrates typical long-distance wagon travel. The distance was roughly 350–400 miles, depending on route. The journey would take 3–4 weeks in good conditions, longer in bad weather or with delays. The merchant would load cloth from Flanders, travel through multiple territories each with its own tolls and regulations, cross major rivers like the Rhine, requiring ferries, pass through various towns and forests, and face all the hazards already described. The profits from selling Flemish cloth at Frankfurt Fair had to cover transport costs, tolls, food and lodging, animal costs, guards' wages, and still leave margin for profit and risk of loss. The costs of long-distance wagon travel were substantial and included the wagon itself, expensive to build or rent, draft animals. Oxen cost significant sums to buy or rent, fodder and care for animals, tolls at bridges and gates, accommodation and food for drivers and guards, repairs to wagon and equipment, guards' wages for valuable cargo, and opportunity costs of time spent traveling rather than working. A merchant might spend 20 to 30% of cargo value on transport costs. For less valuable goods, transport costs could make long-distance trade unprofitable. Only goods with high value-to-weight ratios, luxury textiles, spices, metals, fine pottery, justified long-distance wagon transport in many cases. The alternative to wagon travel included pack animals for lighter loads and greater flexibility, boats for river and coastal transport where available, and simply not traveling. Producing and consuming locally. Pack animals could use routes impassable to wagons, but carried less cargo. River transport was much cheaper and faster than wagon when available, but was limited to navigable rivers and required offloading onto wagons for final delivery. The choice of transport method depended on cargo type, route, and costs. Merchants used whatever method was most profitable for specific goods and destinations. The women who traveled by wagon faced specific challenges beyond those affecting men. Women traveling alone were rare and suspicious. They risked being assumed to be prostitutes or criminals. Respectable women traveled with male relatives or in groups. Pregnant women faced particular dangers from the rough travel, which could cause miscarriage or premature labor. Women with children had to manage them in cramped, bouncing wagon while also dealing with all other travel difficulties. The lack of privacy for bodily functions was especially difficult for women. The sexual assault risk was real. Women traveling were vulnerable to attack from bandits, fellow travelers, or innkeepers. Most women who had to travel long distances did so only when absolutely necessary. The children who traveled by wagon suffered from the journey's hardships without fully understanding why. Young children found the long days in bouncing wagon boring and uncomfortable. They couldn't run around or play. They got sick from motion, poor food, and exposure. Infants needed feeding and changing in impossible conditions. Children's complaints and needs added stress to already difficult journey. The mortality rate for children on long journeys was probably higher than for adults because children were more vulnerable to disease, exposure, and accident. Families traveling with children faced additional challenges that made journeys even more arduous. The elderly who attempted long wagon journeys often didn't survive them. The physical stress of constant bouncing, poor food, exposure to weather, and lack of rest was hard on old bodies. Chronic conditions worsened. Injuries from the rough travel didn't heal well. Many elderly people who had to travel did so only for compelling reasons. Pilgrimage to holy site before death, fleeing war or persecution, or moving to be with family. The journey itself could be the cause of death, as weak bodies couldn't withstand the stresses. Some elderly travelers died on the road and were buried in unfamiliar places far from home. The legal framework governing travel included various regulations about roads, tolls, markets, and travelers' rights. In theory, travelers were protected by King's Peace or similar concepts that made attacking travelers serious crime. In practice, enforcement was weak in remote areas. Merchants had some legal protections for their goods and contracts, but these varied by jurisdiction. Foreigners had fewer rights than locals. Jews and other minorities faced additional restrictions and dangers. The legal patchwork meant that rules changed as you crossed territorial boundaries, creating confusion and opportunities for exploitation by authorities. The trade fairs that were destinations for many merchant journeys were elaborate events where merchants from across Europe gathered to buy and sell goods. The major fairs, Champagne fairs in France, Frankfurt fairs in Germany, Stourbridge Fair in England, attracted thousands of merchants and lasted days or weeks. The fairs had organized schedules with different goods sold on different days. They had courts to settle disputes, money changers to handle different currencies, and authorities to maintain order. Reaching a major fair after weeks of difficult travel was culmination of journey and opportunity for profit, though the competition was intense and profits weren't guaranteed. The return journey after completing business at destination was often harder than the outbound journey. You might be carrying different cargo, purchase goods to sell back home, cash from sales, or returning empty if you'd sold everything. An empty wagon could travel faster but generated no revenue and still incurred all transport costs. The return might follow different route to avoid tolls already paid or to access different markets. The fatigue from the outbound journey made the return more exhausting. Many travelers rested for days or weeks before attempting the return trip. The pilgrimage traffic that shared roads with merchants had different character. Pilgrims traveled to holy sites, Jerusalem, Rome, Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, for religious purposes. They often traveled in groups for safety and mutual support. These pilgrimage routes had churches, monasteries, and hospices providing free or cheap accommodation. Pilgrims begged for food and lodging in the name of Christian charity. They carried distinctive symbols, scallop shells for Santiago, palm fronds for Jerusalem, identifying them as pilgrims entitled to charitable treatment. The pilgrims and merchants used same roads but had different priorities and resources. The relocation journeys that entire households undertook when moving between estates or to new lands were massive undertakings. A noble's household moving might have dozens of wagons carrying furniture, supplies, servants, and family members. The logistics were complex, coordinating many wagons, managing large numbers of people and animals, arranging accommodation for whole entourage. The costs were enormous. The pace was slow because the caravan could only move as fast as the slowest wagon. These household moves happened occasionally, when nobles shifted between properties or when families emigrated to frontier regions seeking land. The military movements that required transporting armies, supplies, and equipment by wagon were specialized operations that strained available transport. An army of thousands needed enormous supplies, food for men and horses, weapons, ammunition, tents, tools. The supply wagons accompanied army or followed behind, vulnerable to enemy raids. The army's pace was determined by supply wagons' ability to keep up. Many military campaigns failed because supply lines broke down and armies starved despite military victory. The military use of wagons created competition with civilian transport and sometimes involved requisitioning civilian wagons and animals, devastating local economies. The construction materials that had to be transported for building projects, stone, timber, iron, required heavy wagons and strong animals. Stone quarries and timber forests were often distant from building sites. The transport costs for construction materials were a significant part of total building costs. Major projects like cathedrals required continuous stream of wagons bringing materials over months or years. The roads near construction sites became heavily damaged from the heavy traffic, requiring constant repair. The material transport created employment for teamsters and wagon drivers, but also created conflicts over road use and damage. The seasonal migration that occurred in some regions involved herders moving flocks between summer and winter pastures, bringing all their possessions in wagons. The transhumance routes were traditional paths used for generations. The migrating groups had to negotiate passage through territories, pay tolls, and avoid conflicts with settled populations. The migrations were predictable annual events, but still involved all the risks and difficulties of any long journey. The herders had extensive knowledge of their routes and could navigate them in all conditions, but the journey was still arduous and dangerous. The trade routes that connected different regions had different characters. The routes between Flanders and Italy through Alpine passes faced mountain challenges, narrow paths, steep grades, avalanche danger in winter, and bandits exploiting bottlenecks at passes. The routes across northern European plains dealt with mud, rivers, and forests, but avoided mountains. The routes to and from ports connected inland areas to maritime trade. Each route had established stopping points, known dangers, and experienced travelers who knew the roads. The major routes saw continuous traffic during travel season, creating communities of teamsters, innkeepers, and others serving travelers. The weather prediction that travelers attempted was based on observation and folk wisdom. Red sky at night meant fair weather, red sky in morning meant storms. Animal behavior supposedly indicated weather changes. The phase of moon influenced travel planning. But medieval weather prediction was unreliable, and travelers were often caught by unexpected storms or unseasonable conditions. Being caught in severe weather, blizzard, thunderstorm, flooding, could be fatal. The wagon provided minimal shelter, and travelers had to endure whatever conditions occurred or seek emergency refuge in nearest building. The robbery techniques that bandits used ranged from crude force to elaborate deception. A simple ambush involved hiding until wagon approached, then rushing out with weapons to overpower the travelers. Roadblocks used fallen trees or other obstacles to force wagons to stop where bandits waited. False travelers might join a group, gain trust, then rob victims when opportunity arose. Corrupt toll collectors might be in league with bandits, signaling when valuable cargo passed. The innkeepers might drug travelers and rob them while they slept. Some bandits specialized in particular routes, knowing the terrain and traffic patterns intimately. The resistance that travelers could offer to bandits depended on numbers, weapons, and determination. Merchants with armed guards might fight back successfully. Groups of travelers could defend each other, but isolated travelers or those without weapons had little choice but to surrender and hope to survive. Fighting back risked death. Bandits who faced resistance were more likely to kill. Giving up cargo peacefully usually meant survival, though you lost your goods and might be left without means to continue journey. The calculation of whether to resist or surrender was life or death decision that travelers sometimes faced. The cooperation between travelers that emerged from shared dangers created temporary communities. Groups traveling same route would join together for safety, share expenses for guards, help each other with broken wagons or sick animals, and pool knowledge about road conditions and dangers ahead. These temporary alliances dissolved when routes diverged or destinations were reached. but they provided mutual support during journey. The experienced travelers helped novices, knowing that someone had helped them when they started. The mutual aid was partly practical necessity and partly cultural norm that travelers should help each other. The seasonal rhythms of trade created busy periods on major routes when caravans of merchants all traveled to same fairs or markets, and quiet periods when few travelers were on roads. The busy periods meant crowded inns, competition for resources, and higher prices, but also safer travel due to numbers. The quiet periods meant better availability of accommodation and less competition, but greater danger from bandits who knew that isolated travelers were easy targets. The timing of journeys had to balance these factors with the business cycles that determined when particular goods were available or in demand. The technological improvements that occurred during medieval period gradually made wagon travel slightly easier, though still difficult. Better harness designs distributed load more efficiently on animals. Iron fittings made wagons stronger and more durable. Improved road maintenance on major routes reduced the worst obstacles. The development of better springs and suspension in late medieval period made rides less bone-jarring for passengers, though freight wagons remained crude. These improvements were incremental and affected only some wagons and some routes, but they represented slow progress toward better transport. The comparison between different regions' wagon travel shows significant variations. Northern European roads through flat terrain were easier than Alpine routes, but faced mud problems. Mediterranean regions had better weather, but mountainous terrain in many areas. English roads were notoriously bad in many areas, prompting complaints and occasional improvement efforts. German territories had many political boundaries, creating numerous tolls. French routes benefited from some Roman road maintenance, but still declined from ancient standards. Each region had specific challenges that affected travel difficulty and costs. The economic impact of transport costs on trade patterns was substantial. Goods traveled long distances only if their value justified transport costs. Bulk goods like grain, timber, or stone were rarely transported far because transport costs exceeded their value. Luxury goods, spices, fine textiles, metalwork, wines could bear high transport costs and were the basis of long-distance trade. The transport costs created price differentials between regions that merchants exploited, buying cheap in production areas, selling expensive in consumption areas, with the difference covering transport costs and providing profit. The monasteries that provided hospitality to travelers performed valuable social service. Monastic hospitality was Christian duty, welcoming strangers as if they were Christ himself. The monasteries along major routes had dedicated guest facilities, stables for animals, and organized systems for receiving travelers. They provided clean beds, adequate food, and security without charge, though wealthy travelers were expected to donate generously. The monastic hospitality made long-distance travel feasible for pilgrims and others who couldn't afford inns. The network of monasteries along pilgrimage routes was essential infrastructure that enabled medieval travel. The disease transmission that occurred through travel was a significant factor in spreading epidemics. Travelers carried diseases from infected regions to healthy areas. The Black Death spread along trade routes as infected travelers, rats, and fleas moved from place to place. The crowded conditions in inns and on ferries facilitated disease transmission between travelers from different regions. The attempt by authorities to quarantine travelers from plague areas was early public health measure, though enforcement was difficult and effectiveness limited. The role of travel in disease spread was recognized empirically, though the mechanisms weren't understood. The languages and communication barriers that travelers faced complicated interactions. A merchant from Flanders might speak Flemish and French, but encounter German, Italian, or English speakers on long journey. Latin served as common language among educated people, but most travelers weren't educated. Travelers relied on gestures, interpreters, and basic phrases in multiple languages. The communication difficulties created misunderstandings, made negotiations harder, and left travelers vulnerable to deception by locals who could exploit their ignorance. Learning basic phrases in languages of regions you'd travel through was wise preparation. The currency exchange that merchants dealt with was complicated by the multiplicity of coins and exchange rates. Each territory had its own coinage, and exchange rates varied. Money changers at major fairs and cities performed exchange services for fees. The risk of receiving counterfeit or debased coins was real. Merchants had to be knowledgeable about various currencies and current exchange rates to avoid being cheated. The transport of large amounts of coin was heavy. Precious metals are dense and attracted robbers. Letters of credit and other financial instruments began developing in late medieval period to reduce need to carry actual coin. The insurance and risk management for merchant cargo began developing in late medieval period. Merchants formed partnerships to spread risk. If one wagon was robbed, the others might get through successfully. The bottomry and respondentia loans for maritime trade had parallels in overland trade. You borrowed money for a journey and repaid with interest only if cargo arrived safely, transferring risk to lender. The insurance concepts that would later become formal industry were beginning to emerge as merchants sought ways to manage the enormous risks of long-distance trade. The professional teamsters and wagon drivers who transported goods for hire were specialized workers who knew the routes and had necessary equipment and animals. Hiring teamsters meant you paid them to transport your goods while you traveled separately or stayed home, avoiding the journey's hardships yourself. The teamsters took responsibility for cargo safety, though disputes about damage or losses were common. The teamster profession created a class of people who spent most of their lives on the road, living in wagons or inns, constantly traveling between the same cities on established routes. The roadside services that developed along major routes included inns, smithies, wheelwrights, stables, and general supply stores. These businesses existed specifically to serve travelers and derived all their income from the passing trade. The inn might also function as warehouse, money exchange, and message center. The smithy repaired wagons and shod animals. The wheelwright made and repaired wheels and other wooden components. These roadside establishments charged premium prices due to travelers' desperation and lack of alternatives. Some were honest businesses providing fair value. Others were exploitation operations, charging whatever the market would bear. The message and mail services that existed in medieval period were limited compared to modern systems, but served important functions. Royal courts and the church had organized courier systems for official correspondence. Merchants used traveling colleagues to carry letters and messages. The universities had networks for exchanging academic correspondence. But there was no public postal system for ordinary people. If you needed to send a message during travel, you hired a courier, sent it with another traveler going that direction, or delivered it yourself. The unreliability and expense of messages meant that many communications were delayed or never sent. The environmental impact of wagon traffic included road damage, deforestation for wagon construction and road clearing, and overgrazing along routes where draft animals fed. The heavy wagons tore up roads, creating ruts that channeled rainwater and caused erosion. The demand for timber for wagon construction contributed to forest clearing. The large numbers of draft animals in some areas consumed vegetation and compacted soil. Medieval people didn't think in terms of environmental impact, but the effects of transport on landscape were real and sometimes locally significant. The romantic narratives about wagon travel that emerged in literature and song portrayed journeys as adventures with excitement and danger. The reality was mostly tedium, punctuated by moments of fear. The romantic stories emphasized bandits, tournaments, noble quests, and dramatic encounters. The reality was days of monotonous travel, uncomfortable conditions, mundane interactions, and practical concerns about costs and logistics. The literature served entertainment purposes but didn't reflect actual travel experience. Modern romantic notions about medieval travel derive partly from these literary traditions rather than historical reality. The specific route example of Canterbury pilgrimage route from London illustrates well-documented medieval journey. The distance was about 60 miles, taking 3 to 4 days for walking pilgrims or 2 or 3 days by wagon. The route had established stopping points in towns like Rochester and was well-traveled and relatively safe due to pilgrimage traffic. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, late 14th century, describes diverse group of pilgrims traveling together and telling stories to pass time. The literary depiction, while fictional, captures some aspects of medieval travel: the mixed company, the storytelling, the religious purpose, though it sanitizes the discomfort and danger. The economic multiplier effects of travel created employment and business opportunities along major routes. The inns employed staff, cooks, servers, stablers, cleaners. The smithies and wheelwrights had steady business. The farmers along routes sold fodder and food to travelers. The towns with markets attracted traveling merchants who needed supplies. The churches collected donations from pilgrims. The tolls supported toll collectors and their enforcement staff. The entire economy along major routes depended on continuous flow of travelers, and disruptions, wars, plague, bad harvests, that reduced travel caused economic hardship for these communities. The social stratification visible in travel conditions showed who had wealth and power. Wealthy nobles traveled in relative comfort in covered wagons with cushions accompanied by servants and guards, staying in the best accommodations. Prosperous merchants had decent wagons and could afford guards and good inns. Poor pilgrims and laborers walked or rode in crude carts, slept in rough shelters or outdoors, and survived on minimal rations. The differences in travel conditions reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. The roads brought different social classes into proximity, but maintained distinctions through the quality of conveyance, accommodation, and treatment. The historical documentation about wagon travel comes from various sources. Merchant account books record transport costs and journey details. Pilgrimage narratives describe routes and experiences. Chronicles mention notable journeys by nobles or armies. Legal records document toll rates, road maintenance obligations, and disputes over travel-related issues. Archaeological evidence includes wagon parts, road surfaces, bridges, and inn sites. The documentation is fragmentary and biased toward wealthy and literate travelers, but it provides information about medieval travel practices and conditions. The comparison between medieval wagon travel and contemporary boat travel shows advantages and disadvantages of each. Boats could carry more cargo with less effort using currents and sails. Water transport was faster and cheaper per mile for bulk goods. But boats were limited to navigable rivers and coasts, required transshipment to wagons for final delivery, and faced risks of storms, pirates, and mechanical problems. Wagons could go anywhere roads existed, provided door-to-door delivery, and were independent of weather for movement, though weather affected road conditions. The choice between water and land transport depended on route, cargo, and costs. The military logistics of wagon trains supporting armies illustrate large-scale organized transport. An army of 10,000 might need hundreds of supply wagons carrying food, ammunition, weapons, tools, tents, and equipment. The wagon trains required hundreds of teamsters and thousands of draft animals. The wagons slowed armies' march and were vulnerable to enemy raids. Protecting the supply train required detaching troops from main force. Many battles were fought over supply lines and wagon trains. The military wagon trains were organized with military discipline, but still faced all the problems of civilian wagon travel plus combat dangers. The technological stagnation in wagon design during much of medieval period reflects conservative approach to transportation technology. The basic wagon design changed little for centuries. Four wheels, wooden frame, animal power. Innovations that did occur, better harnesses, springs, suspension, diffused slowly and unevenly. The lack of incentive for innovation partly reflected adequate profitability of existing systems and partly reflected cultural attitudes that preferred traditional methods to experimental new designs. The dramatic improvements in transportation wouldn't come until Industrial Revolution created new technologies and economic pressures. The future developments that would eventually transform overland transport were not foreseeable to medieval travelers. The paved roads, suspension systems, metal wheels, and eventually motorized vehicles were centuries away. Medieval travelers assumed that transport technology would remain essentially unchanged, as it had been for centuries past. The gradual improvements in roads, wagons, and harnesses continued, but revolutionary change weren't anticipated. The medieval wagon remained the cutting-edge transport technology throughout the period, improving incrementally but not fundamentally transforming. The personal accounts from medieval travelers that survive are rare but valuable. Marjorie Kempe, an English mystic, described her pilgrimage travels in the 15th century, including the hardships of long journeys and the hostility she faced as a woman traveling without male supervision. Various merchants' letters describe business journeys with practical details about costs, routes, and problems encountered. Pilgrimage narratives describe journeys to Jerusalem and other holy sites with details about routes, dangers, and experiences. These accounts provide human perspectives on travel that statistics and regulations don't capture. The seasonal celebrations and festivals that punctuated travel provided occasional relief from monotony. Reaching a town during a festival meant entertainment, special food, and festive atmosphere. The major religious holidays like Christmas and Easter were observed even by travelers, with special meals if possible and attendance at services. Market days and fairs were exciting destinations after weeks of travel. These occasions broke up the tedium and provided motivation to endure the journey's hardships. The festive occasions also created opportunities for business, socializing, and cultural exchange. The cultural exchange that occurred through travel spread ideas, technologies, and customs. Merchants traveling between regions carried not just goods, but also information, news from distant areas, knowledge of different practices, awareness of innovations. The travelers served as vectors of cultural diffusion, whether deliberately or incidentally. The pilgrims, returning from distant shrines, brought back stories and souvenirs. The students traveling to universities encountered different intellectual traditions. The knights traveling to tournaments met and competed with nobles from other regions. Travel, despite its difficulties, connected medieval Europe's diverse regions and facilitated cultural integration. The psychological impact of long journeys on travelers included both stress and transformation. The extended time away from home, the dangers faced, the hardships endured, and the exposure to different places and people could be transformative experiences. Pilgrims often describe spiritual transformations resulting from difficult journeys. Merchants gained worldliness and knowledge from travel. Young nobles sent on diplomatic missions or to foreign courts matured from travel experiences. But travel also caused stress, anxiety, and sometimes trauma from robberies, accidents, or witnessing violence. The psychological effects varied by individual and circumstances, but were significant for most who undertook long journeys. The legacy of medieval wagon routes persists in modern geography. Many modern roads follow medieval routes, which themselves often followed ancient Roman roads or even prehistoric paths. The routes chosen for practical reasons, connecting important settlements, following terrain features, using river crossings, remained optimal for subsequent road building. Some medieval bridges still stand and carry traffic. The town locations that developed at crossroads or river crossings remain important today. The trade routes that connected regions in medieval period influenced economic relationships that persist in modern regional identities and trade patterns. The mortality rate from travel is impossible to calculate precisely, but was certainly higher than staying home. Travelers faced risks of violence, accidents, disease, and exposure that sedentary people avoided. Some journeys saw high casualty rates, military campaigns, plague-era travel, winter journeys in harsh conditions. The overall mortality was probably low enough not to deter necessary travel, but high enough that travelers made wills before departing and said farewells, acknowledging they might not return. The acceptance of travel dangers as unavoidable reflects medieval attitudes toward risk and fate that differ from modern safety consciousness. The religious motivations that drove many travelers included pilgrimage to earn spiritual merit, fulfill vows, seek healing at saint's shrine, or do penance for sins. The religious travelers included wealthy nobles making elaborate pilgrimages, poor people walking vast distances with minimal resources, and everyone in between. The pilgrimage was seen as spiritually transformative journey, where hardships were part of spiritual benefit. Suffering during pilgrimage earned divine favor. The religious framework made travel meaningful beyond practical purposes and provided psychological sustenance during hardships. The commercial networks that developed through repeated travel by merchants created relationships and knowledge that facilitated trade. The merchant who regularly traveled a route knew the reliable inns, honest ferrymen, fair toll collectors, and trustworthy correspondents at destination. The networks of trust and information reduced transaction costs and risks. The merchant families who intermarried across regions created kinship networks that supported business. The guilds and trading associations created formal structures for cooperation and mutual support. These networks were essential infrastructure for long-distance trade. The crime and law enforcement along roads varied by jurisdiction, but was generally inadequate. The responsibility for road safety theoretically belonged to territorial lords who should have suppressed bandits and maintained order. In practice, enforcement was sporadic and often ineffective. Some lords actively combated banditry, executing captured bandits and patrolling roads. Others ignored the problem or were complicit, collecting protection money from bandits or organizing robberies themselves through proxies. The travelers had limited recourse. Reporting robberies might lead to investigation, but rarely to recovery of goods or punishment of perpetrators. The specific example of the Via Francigena, the pilgrimage route from Canterbury to Rome, illustrates a major medieval route. The route crossed England, France, Switzerland, and Italy, roughly 1,000 miles, taking 2 to 3 months to walk, or 4 to 6 weeks by wagon, in good conditions. The route passed through multiple kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, each with different laws and tolls. It crossed the Alps through the Great St. Bernard Pass, a dangerous mountain crossing. Along the route, churches and monasteries provided hospitality to pilgrims. The Via Francigena was well established with known stopping points, but still presented all the challenges of medieval travel. The environmental conditions that affected travel included not just weather, but also seasonal factors like flood cycles, snowpack in mountains, and drought conditions affecting water sources. The spring floods that made rivers impassable or washed out bridges could delay journeys for weeks. The summer droughts that dried up wells and streams created water shortages for animals and travelers. The autumn rains that turned roads to mud were predictable, but still created difficult conditions. The winter snows that blocked mountain passes made some routes completely impassable for months. Understanding and working within these environmental cycles was essential for successful travel. The personal items that travelers carried were minimal by modern standards. You might have a change of clothing, basic tools for repairs, eating utensils, water container, blankets or bedroll, perhaps a weapon for protection, money, and valuables hidden on your person, and documents, letters of credit, safe conducts, identification. Wealthy travelers had more possessions and servants to carry them. Poor travelers had almost nothing beyond what they wore and carried. The limitation on personal belongings reflected practical constraints of weight and space, as well as the risk of theft. Bringing valuable items on dangerous journey was foolish unless necessary. The navigation landmarks that travelers used included distinctive natural features, particular hills, rivers, rock formations, and human landmarks like churches, monasteries, bridges, and crosses erected at significant points. The wayside crosses served both religious purposes and navigation markers. Travelers learned routes by memorizing sequences of landmarks and directions at each. The lack of accurate maps meant that verbal descriptions and memorization were primary navigation methods. Getting lost could be fatal. So learning routes thoroughly was essential for regular travelers. The social bonds formed through shared travel sometimes persisted after journeys ended. Traveling companions who'd helped each other through dangers became friends. Merchants who'd done business together on the road became regular trading partners. Pilgrims who'd traveled together sometimes maintained correspondence. The shared hardships and dangers created relationships that might not have formed in normal circumstances. Some travel friendships were maintained through letters renewed on subsequent journeys or resulted in business partnership. Others were fleeting connections forgotten after reaching destination. The hygiene and sanitation for travelers were minimal, contributing to disease transmission and discomfort. You couldn't bathe regularly, water was too precious, and facilities didn't exist on the road. Clothes became dirty and infested with lice and fleas. Toilet facilities were whatever bushes or ditches were available near stopping points. The chronic filthiness was accepted as unavoidable aspect of travel. Arriving at destination meant cleaning up as well as possible. Though medieval cleanliness standards were low even for stationary people, the accumulation of grime and vermin over weeks of travel was uncomfortable and unhealthy, but unavoidable. The final miles of journey toward destination often presented specific challenges. The approach to major cities meant increased traffic, more tolls at city gates, and navigation through suburbs and approaches. The toll collectors at city gates inspected cargo and charged entry fees. The city might have regulations about where wagons could go or when they could enter. Finding the right marketplace, warehouse, or inn required local knowledge or asking directions. The anticipation of reaching destination after weeks or months of travel created eagerness that had to be balanced with patience to handle final obstacles properly. The arrival at destination brought relief from journey's dangers and hardships, but immediately presented new challenges. Merchants had to unload cargo, store it securely, find buyers, negotiate prices, arrange payment, and begin preparing for return journey or next destination. Pilgrims had to find accommodation, visit the shrine, attend services, and arrange onward or return travel. Household groups had to settle into new residence and establish themselves in new community. The arrival was transition from travel mode to settled mode, requiring different skills and adjustments. The assessment of whether wagon travel was worth the costs, risks, and hardships depended on your purpose and results. For merchants whose cargo sold profitably, the journey was worth it despite expenses and dangers. For pilgrims who experienced spiritual fulfillment, the hardships were part of valuable religious exercise. For those relocating by necessity, there was no choice. The journey had to be undertaken regardless of difficulties. For those who lost cargo to bandits, arrived with damaged goods, or suffered injury or illness, the journey was disaster. The calculation of whether travel was worthwhile was made before departure based on expected benefits versus known costs. But the actual outcome couldn't be known until journey was complete. The alternative to wagon travel was not traveling at all, staying home, conducting business locally, living your entire life in limited geographic area. For most medieval people, this was the reality. They never traveled more than a few miles from birthplace. The minority who traveled by wagon were merchants, pilgrims, migrants, and others with compelling reasons to move. The choice to travel represented significant decision with consequences for finances, safety, and life trajectory. What that choice entailed, the genuine hardships and dangers, makes clear that medieval people didn't travel casually or for recreation, but only when necessity or strong motivation justified the enormous difficulties. The ultimate reality of medieval wagon travel was that it was expensive, dangerous, exhausting, and unavoidable for anyone who needed to transport goods or themselves over distances. The technology was crude, the infrastructure was inadequate, the dangers were real, and the discomforts were constant. Yet trade, pilgrimage, migration, and other necessary movements meant that wagons rolled along medieval roads despite all difficulties. The travelers endured conditions that modern people would find intolerable because they had no better options and because their purposes, profit, faith, survival, justified the hardships. Medieval wagon travel was triumph of necessity and determination over obstacles that would have stopped anyone with alternatives. The comparison between medieval wagon travel and modern road trips reveals how dramatically transportation has improved. A journey that took medieval travelers 3 or 4 weeks in constant discomfort, danger, and expense can now be completed in a day of relatively comfortable driving with minimal risk. The roads are paved, smooth, and well maintained. The vehicles have suspension, climate control, and safety features. The infrastructure provides fuel, food, rest facilities, and emergency services. The legal framework protects travelers and punishes highway robbery severely. The technological revolution in transportation has made travel accessible, affordable, and safe in ways medieval people couldn't imagine. Yet the basic human need to travel for business, family, religion, or new opportunities remains constant across centuries, showing that while methods change, fundamental human motivations endure. The merchants, pilgrims, and migrants who filled medieval roads with their wagons were ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. They endured weeks of bone-jarring rides, constant fear of bandits, exposure to weather, poor food, uncertain accommodation, and significant expenses, all while knowing that many who started such journeys never completed them. Their determination to travel despite these obstacles speaks to the power of human commerce, faith, and the search for better circumstances to overcome even the most daunting practical difficulties. Being on the road in medieval Europe meant accepting that the journey itself was trial to be endured, not an experience to be enjoyed, a means to an end where survival and arrival were achievements. So the next time you complain about a long road trip, the uncomfortable seats, the boring hours, the expensive gas, remember the reality of medieval wagon travel, the wooden wagons with no suspension bouncing over rutted dirt tracks at walking pace, the 10-15 miles per day, taking 3 to 4 weeks to cover 100 miles, the bandits wading in forests to rob and kill travelers, the tolls charged at every bridge and town gate, consuming profits, the roads that were impassable mud and rain and frozen ruts in winter, the constant breakdowns requiring repairs, and the knowledge that many travelers never reach their destination. Remember that the journey itself could kill you through exposure, disease, accidents, or violence. Being a medieval traveler meant enduring weeks of bone-jarring discomfort in a crude wagon pulled by slow oxen over terrible roads, while constantly fearing bandits, worrying about expenses, and dealing with broken wheels, sick animals, bad weather, and corrupt toll collectors. The romantic notion of medieval journey as adventure ignores that the reality was monotonous misery, punctuated by moments of genuine terror. Successful completion of long wagon journey was achievement worth celebrating, because it meant you'd survive dangers and overcome obstacles that killed or ruined many others who attempted similar journeys. And so ends our journey through medieval wagon travel. If you enjoyed this exploration of reality behind the romanticized images, subscribe for more journeys revealing historical truths. Leave a comment telling me which aspect of medieval travel surprised you most, or suggest another topic you'd like me to explore. Sleep well, time traveler. And maybe tonight, appreciate that modern roads are paved and smooth, that cars have suspension and comfort features medieval travelers couldn't imagine, that a journey taking medieval people weeks now takes hours, that bandits don't ambush travelers on highways, that if your car breaks down you can call for help rather than being stranded, and that modern travel is so safe and comfortable that we treat it as unremarkable rather than as the dangerous ordeal it was for our ancestors. Appreciate the transportation revolution that transformed travel from expensive, dangerous ordeal into routine convenience. Sweet dreams.